I get a bunch of questions about how to or how I treat baseball players, in particular ones that have had shoulder or elbow problems. And it's really, in my mind, it's not that complicated. I think the most important part, and this probably goes for any athlete, is that you understand what they need to do in their sport and the positions they need to get into, both from a lower extremity standpoint and an upper extremity standpoint, right? So you take a pitcher, for example, and if you deconstruct their movement, they need to get into one, single leg balance on the backside. So if it's a right-handed pitcher, it's their right leg. They've got to balance on the right leg. And then from there, they've got to start to push off the mound. So they need some sort of lateral force or lateral component where their foot's pushing into the ground off the mound, right? So they're pushing off that backside. You have to understand they're going to land on the front side and be able to stabilize that front side. So as they're doing that, they're going to need good control on that front leg. So again, for a right-handed pitcher, it's going to be left leg control. So getting down to that lunge position and then stabilizing that, which I think is important, especially for our youth. So making sure they can get into that stable position and then extend. So now you drove down the mound, you've got a good stride, but now you've got to extend that power up, right? So now we're trying to take the force you developed from the ground and drive it up the chain. The next step from there, or that next link up the chain, is going to be the hips. So now the hips, the pelvis, and the core are going to have to take that power. So what do you need there, right? So we already drove off the backside. We're absorbing the force, extending the front side. So now we need good hip and shoulder separation, right? The guys that throw hard have elite hip and shoulder separation, which means the torso, there's a degree from the torso to the shoulders, right, where we're twisting in that core, that mid spine area, that thoracic spine. So we need sufficient thoracic spine rotation while the pelvis is staying fixed, right? So we need good thoracic spine rotation. And then I think the more important part is linking the upper body. Right? We spend so much time talking about upper body injuries, but I think a lot of that comes from inefficiencies down the chain. So now they go into T-spine rotation, right? And as they rotate, they're going to also extend in their thoracic spine. So we're coming into a position of layback now, right? And so for layback, it's when that pitcher's arm is all the way back into maximum external rotation. If you think about that position alone, you're going to extend the spine, right? Thoracic lumbar spine extension. As you're doing that, the scapula is going to retract. So the scapula is rotating down, retracting, and the arm's coming back into external rotation at the same time. So if you think that position alone, so in rehab, some people are all about just neutral exercises or shoulder exercises, isolated exercise with the core in neutral position. And I think there's a role for that. There's definitely a role for isolated exercise. But I think if we're working on some of the end stage rehab, we've got to get these players into a position that mimics the position they need to see in their sport. And for a pitcher, you need to get them into a position of thoracic extension, scap retraction, and shoulder external rotation at the same time. So a simple exercise for that might be just prone on the table, extend off the table, so chest lifts off the table, and bring your arms into a 90-90 position, or like a W position off the table. Another simple one you could do is lay over one of those big exercise balls, curl over it. And then as you extend back, so as you bring your chest up and come into spinal extension, you're bringing your arms up into a 90-90 position. So in that position alone, you're getting that thoracic extension or spinal extension, you're getting scap retraction, and you're getting shoulder external rotation at the same time. So again, a very efficient exercise. That might be a little later stage for an overhead athlete if they're coming off of a surgery, maybe a little sooner if it's just coming off of like rotator cuff irritation or non-operative condition. So we have that position, right? So now we have the layback covered. Now they've got to accelerate the arm. So now they're going from a position of extension to a position of spinal flexion and internal rotation of the shoulder with scap protraction. So don't forget that. So we're coming from the extreme extension, external rotation, to the extreme flexion, internal rotation. So again, now we've got to control getting out of extension, coming into flexion, combined with scapular protraction and glenohumeral or shoulder internal rotation. So simple exercise there. I like just starting with a sit up with an overhead reach. So I think about combining the anterior core and the serratus at the same time, because those muscles are linked through some of the muscular and the fascial slings. So a simple sit up, I'll go double upside down kettlebell. So as the player sits up, then they're going to reach up overhead with the kettlebell. So we're getting the anterior core with the sit up, we're getting the serratus with the reach, and the kettlebells will help stabilize the shoulders. So we're going to have some cuff and scap stabilization at the same time. That's one of my favorites for that anterior sling. And then they're going to come into a position, right? So they're going to accelerate, but then they're going to rapidly decelerate. So now, what are we giving our patients to help with that deceleration phase? And for me, it's a lot of eccentrics. I mean, you've got to get their posterior cuff strong from an eccentric standpoint. And I think back in, early 2000s when we started doing this, we were doing like the eccentric throws with the ball. You throw the ball over their shoulder, they catch it, which I think there's a role for that. I just don't think that mimics the speed or the force they need to see. So I will still incorporate that a little bit in the clinic, but we'll go pretty heavy eccentric with bands, diagonal eccentrics, eccentric manuals on the table, both in a PNF diagonal pattern and an internal external rotation pattern. So we got to make sure that their posterior cuff can absorb the force that they're developing during their throw. And we know that force is significant. So as they accelerate, they're also going to have to decelerate. So don't forget about the brakes for these players. So, I mean, again, that's briefly how I think about just our pitchers in general, right? And you can go through any other position player, any other sport thinking the same way. And that's what goes through my mind as I'm trying to rehab them. And the phase of the rehab is going to dictate what exercise I do. So, for example, that might be towards the end. So right after that, then we've got to get them speeding up. So we might add med balls and plyos and stuff like that at the end. But as we're going through rehab, there's definitely a role for isolated muscle strengthening. So I don't stay away from, rotator cuff strengthening, isometric internal external rotation strength. I think you need to build the base. So if you don't have that sound base and that foundation set, I think the linking exercises can become a bit difficult. And you might see some compensation patterns as they go through some of their linking exercises. So as I'm starting, a progression, whether surgical or non-surgical, I typically will start with isolated strengthening, right? So we'll do something for the core early on. I'll have them do some balance exercise. I'll have them do some hip and shoulder separation drill, whether it's just activation and mobility with a stick on their back, or just open book stretching to try and maintain their mobility. Isometrics at the end for stability, but absolutely work in their rotator cuff isometrics, scapula activation exercises, prone. There's so many different ways to work that. And then as I progress through rehab, I'll go from some isolated exercises to some combined movements. And then I will start to speed up those combined movements. So if we move into a simple cable column row, I might have them do a split stance row. So we're getting retraction, and then I'll have them rotate at the same time. So T-spine rotation with scap retraction. And then we'll flip them around, do the same for a press. So we'll do a shoulder or T-spine rotation into a single arm press in a split stance position. Their rotator cuff exercises might progress from isometrics to isotonics, and then we obviously get into the 90-90 position. I think a lot of people or some people might skip this in the 90-90 where we combine. So we don't just do pure 90-90. I'll combine internal rotation with a punch. So if they're facing away from the resistance or the band, I'll have them internally rotate their arm, and then we'll give it a press at the end. So you get that internal rotation component plus the scap protraction at the end, which obviously will start to mimic the positions that they need to get into to pitch. And we'll do the same for external rotation. So we might do a row, so we get scap retraction with external rotation, so we get scap plus cuff, which I think is important. The role of the scap, we're going to have a whole nother talk on this, but the role of the scap in baseball is so important, both for retraction and protraction. So, and that also is going to help offload your cuff a little bit. So we know we want to try and avoid cuff injuries in baseball at all costs because the outcomes are absolutely terrible coming off of a cuff injury or cuff surgery, you should say. So we want to make sure we set that foundation, and it goes down from the scap and so much further than the scap though. So core is involved, the hips involved, the legs and the balance is involved. So we definitely want to trickle down, but I'll spend a lot of time in the upper extremity to start, and then we'll gradually move down to lower extremity as we progress. So again, just briefly, if you're really trying to think about how to treat these athletes and you want to treat a baseball pitcher in particular the way that they should be treated, I think you try and just deconstruct, and there's 1,000 exercises you can do. There's no wrong way to do this. But if you understand the mechanics and you understand the positions that they need to get into for their sport, then you can absolutely be successful in treating these athletes. And again, you're not wrong if you do, one balance exercise versus another, or a single leg RDL or an airplane, and get the balance in their arms going. As long as you're working those positions, you're trying to stabilize them in those positions and then work them the way they need to be worked, whether eccentrically, concentrically, you add some speed at the end, and you try and match the demands of their sport. I really think that's a key. And then another thing that I've used, and another principle I've used as I progress some of these athletes, is you want to try and gradually increase load, right? So you don't want to spike their stress or stress on the tissue out of the gate. So that's why, again, we'll start with some maybe light isometrics, we'll gradually move to isotonics and then eccentrics. And then we'll gradually speed things up. So I want to make sure they can tolerate, one stimulus before I add another. And then eventually we go to increasing speed with the exercise, and we'll increase the plyometrics. And then from there, we can return to a throwing program. So each step along the way, I'm gradually building the stress on that repaired tissue or the healing tissue to make me feel more comfortable about the progression. So I know how they're tracking. And if you add too much at one time and they get sore, you'll have no idea what caused it. So you don't know what stimulus to remove. So I think those two things, right? If you're going to take two things away from the last 10 minutes, I think one, understand the mechanics and the positions these players need to get into, deconstruct it, and really, really be critical about the positions they need to get into. And you can design your exercises off of that. And then two, just think about gradual incremental increase in load and stress on the tissue as they're rehabbing, as they're progressing, and trying to eventually at the end match the speed and the tension that they might need to see as they return to sport, so that it's just one nice, smooth, gradual increase over time versus spiking up and down, which can cause some uncertainty in their rehab and potential setback along the way. So I hope you guys got something out of this. Please, reach out if you have any questions. Life after the knife, and we'll talk soon.